Welcome to the Reading for Wellbeing Book Club and podcast. I'm your host, Professor Pozzulo. Today, I'm talking with Dr. Catherine Sanderson, author of The Positive Shift, Mastering Mindset to Improve Happiness, Health, and Longevity. Welcome, Dr. Sanderson. Great to talk with you today.
Thank you so much for this invitation to talk. I'm really looking forward to it.
Great. Before we get started, can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and maybe how you got interested in happiness and mindset?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I am a psychology professor at Amherst College, and my work has focused on issues of close relationships, issues of health psychology. And when I was long time ago, when undergraduate studying psychology focused entirely on the negative, neuroses and depression and phobias and all the bad. And there was this wonderful movement in the field of psychology called positive psychology, really looking at evidence-based practices for how people could live happier, healthier lives. And what I was seeing again and again in myself, frankly, in friends, in family members, et cetera, was that lots of people want to be happy, right? We want to be happy. It's a goal. It's something we're working towards. But people often think about happiness as something that happens to them, like if you win the lottery or if you're genetically lucky, or if this wonderful thing, falls on you, as opposed to thinking about steps that we can take in our own lives. And so what I became really interested in was sort of taking the nerdy empirical scientific research and trying to find ways to share it broadly. So that's what led me to start talking about this topic and ultimately led to the book.
Fantastic. Well, so glad that you wrote the book. Great evidence-based information in it. You started off the positive shift by asking, are you naturally happy? To what degree do you think happiness is a fixed quantity?
So it's a great question. And it's one that I think about and talk about a lot. So most of the empirical research, and this isn't my work, but other people's work, shows that about of our happiness is probably rooted in our genes. And so this doesn't mean there's like a happiness gene, but it probably means there's a constellation of different personality traits that may lead you to optimism or extroversion or the ability to overcome adversity, to be resilient in the face of adversity. And so about half of our happiness is rooted in our genes. And that means that some people, sort of have an easy time finding that silver lining, no matter what happens, they anticipate good things happening, they're optimistic. But what I like about that finding, and I'll be perfectly honest, I'm not one of those people who naturally and easily, I'm not in that genetic lottery winner. But what I like about that finding is it also means 50% is not in our genes. And that's a lot, right? That's a lot. So what I think about is that some people have a head start. My husband is pretty naturally happy. It comes pretty easily to him and he can always find that silver lining. I have to work for it.
Okay. Can you talk a bit about the connection between mindset and well-being?
Sure. So when we think about mindset in psychology, it could be a lot of different things. It's basically your thought patterns. And so we can think about mindset as some people are fixed and stable, and this is what you're like across, musical ability or athleticism or optimism or extroversion or whatever. And other people have a growth mindset. You can grow and change and shape these things. But we can also think about mindset in lots of different domains. So one of my favorite findings that I talk about in the book is about our stress mindset, that we often think about stress as being negative, right? Stress is debilitating. Stress is bad for your health. Stress is bad for your vitality. Avoid it at all costs. But we can actually say, you know what? When I'm being pushed to do new things, I'm actually energized and alive and productive. So we can kind of harness that feeling of arousal or stress, and we can approach it with a mindset that is debilitating, or we can focus on it with a mindset that is advantageous. I'm teaching this semester a class in sports psychology, and that's actually a perfect illustration of what elite athletes do, right? Elite athletes face, Olympic trials or must-win game or, must-win, free throw or whatever. And really elite athletes are very good at being, so-called clutch players in which they rise to the occasion and they do their best work. So that's sort of how I think about mindset. A lot of how we experience the world is how we think about the world.
Yeah, amazing. And so powerful because in part, we control how we think. We can control how we think.
Exactly. No, and that's what I love about the finding is, hey, we can't control our genes. We can't control a lot of different things in the world that happen to us, but what we can control is our thoughts.
Mhm. Can you describe some of the strategies in your book to change mindset and perhaps strategies that you use?
Sure. And I want to be clear that it's not as simple as just saying, I'm going to be more positive or I'm going to be more optimistic or I'm going to, think about it. That all of this stuff takes practice. I give the example of I am not a natural runner, but I decided a few years ago I was going to start a jogging habit, mostly in the pandemic when like I couldn't go to the gym and I was stuck. And I am, not really a runner now, but I can run and I run, 3 times a week for 3 miles, 30 minutes, and that's what I do. But it doesn't come easily or naturally to me. And so I think about that in the same way in terms of mindset. So I think one thing is really trying to keep things in comparison. That we can use comparison to be, oh, look at all of these wonderful things that are happening, to other people and not me. Or we can look at comparison in terms of like, hey, you know what? I'm doing better than I was doing before, or I'm doing better, than other people in this way. I think about mindset in terms of changing your thoughts as trying to find some silver lining in any situation. So my father passed away about 2 weeks ago. I'm going to try not to be beepy. I mean, he had dementia. It was, it was not going well, and it was, not an unforeseen thing. But so it was obviously, very hard. But what I continue to say to people who were like, that's so, awful, and I'm so sorry for your loss is, number one, I have a brother that I really get along with. And the two of us, worked together. And I would have felt so isolated if I didn't get along with my brother. And that was a blessing. And then two, my dad was very cooperative. So he was, not fully there mentally, but he knew that we were trying to do what was best for him. And I know that sometimes people with dementia, are obstinate about it or are stubborn or, resistant in that way. And so I feel thankful that we had a close relationship even up to the end. And so again, it's very sad that I lost him, but I had him for 81 years. And that's, a silver lining. So that's the sort of effort that we can all sort of say in any situation, you can find some silver lining. Sometimes you have to look harder and you're really pulling, but we can all sort of make an effort to do that.
Well, I'm very sorry for your loss, and thank you for sharing that. Um, do you think happiness is related to longevity?
Lots and lots of research suggests that it is. And so I'll say two things. One, that's really one of the reasons why those of us who are not naturally happy need to work on it, right? Because I think it is associated with longevity. But I think what's even more interesting is that why, right? What's the mechanism? Again, I am a nerdy academic. So, one of the theories is that people who are optimistic, take better care of their health. Like, I'm going to live a long time, so I may as well, run and eat healthy and, do these things. Another possibility is that people who are happy, maybe they get more social support. Maybe people gravitate towards them. Like we want to be near happy people. And so maybe it's that if you are happy, people help you, people give you rides or, people bring you food when you're sick or, people do other things. So we do know that happy people tend to live longer, but we don't actually know the mechanism. And of course it may be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different things.
Yeah, and very interesting. I have to say, your book really resonated with me. Absolutely loved it. You've got some great chapters around aging, memory, and health. And as we age, sort of picking up on what you were just saying, as we age, are there certain things that we can do to sort of keep that happiness going and that optimism going?
Yes, that's such an important and timely question, as of course we know that, the population is aging and there are going to be more and more people in their 70s and 80s and 90s and beyond. So I think a couple things. One, there's a real concern for some people in their older years about loneliness, about, that you may have lost a spouse, you may have lost your siblings, you've almost certainly lost your parents. And in some cases, people, of course, retire. And so then they lose their work colleagues, in that thing. So one of the things that I think is so important is keeping up social connections. And that could be, volunteering. It could be, being friends with your neighbors, sort of being part of a community organization. It could be, again, staying close with longtime friends, your children, et cetera. But I think loneliness is really hazardous in terms of your health, in terms of dementia. And so finding ways as we age to be active in terms of social connections is really important. I think it's also really important with aging to make sure that we're not falling prey to some of the really negative stereotypes about aging. My brother actually sent me a clip the other night of a story that my nephew had done. My nephew is an editor for his high school paper, and he had done a review of the movie Juror Number 2. And my brother said, "Have you seen it?" And I said, "I haven't seen it." And then he goes, "Did you know that Clint Eastwood, who directed Juror Number 2, is 94? And I was like, 94. I mean, that is amazing. So then you have a man who is 94, who is directing a movie. And that is, that's probably aspirational for all of us who have not directed movies when we're 84, 74, 64, and so on. But it's a perfect illustration of Clint Eastwood's ability to stay active, involved, smart, organized, et cetera. I'm sure he has lots of help, but he's also out there doing it. And so again, we can all find ways of staying, mentally active in our own lives.
And I really like that you said mentally active. I mean, we know that there's lots of benefits to being physically active, but also mentally active, I think is a big one. And ways that we can sort of engage with others, and even if it's engaging with ourselves, reading a book is one that I really enjoy, of course. Can you talk a little bit about maybe any results that surprised you as you were sort of writing the book or researching this area?
So surprised me the most is how much is actually within our control, right? That it really, we think about, people who live a long life, and then we think about, well, how old were their parents when they died, or, et cetera. And of course we can think about the genetic transmission of diseases, whether it's, cancer or high blood pressure or Alzheimer's or whatever. But what we also know is that people make choices about, again, your example, reading books. I think about that all the time with like crossword puzzles, with doing other things. One of the most interesting findings in one of the studies was about older people who did complex things. So that one of the examples was like line dancing, that is actually like surprisingly complex in terms of learning patterns, or doing other things that require sort of learning new skills. I think about that all the time as a college professor, that college students are learning all the time, right? They're taking Spanish, they're taking psychology, they're taking biology, they're taking history, they're doing all these different things. And that is actually prompting their brains, maybe in ways that don't really appreciate, but in distinct ways. And it's so important, I think, to think about in our older years what we can do. One of my favorite examples is travel. That travel inherently is exposing you to new places, whether that's, going to a new museum or historical site, or hearing a new language, or, again, seeing new things. We can all find ways of staying engaged and active in ways that will make us happier and also lead us to be healthier and probably live longer.
Thank you. If there were 3 top messages you wanted our listeners to take away, what would they be?
Okay. Let's see. I'm going to go with, I've got 2 and I'm trying to figure out the third, but I'm going to go with the third. So 1, spending time in nature. Spending time in nature is just a consistent factor that benefits happiness and health. And that could be, going for a hike. It could be looking at an ocean. It could be having plants in your home or office. It could be walking through a park on your lunch hour if you live in an urban environment. But spending time in nature is physiologically relaxing to the brain, to the body. And there's just so many benefits from it, from creativity to elevated mood, to lower blood pressure. So spend some time in nature. That's 1. 2, give. And what I love about the giving one, and this is a whole chapter in my book, of course, giving, is that anything counts. It can be donating blood. It can be giving money to charity. It can be doing a random act of kindness. It can be, treating a friend to lunch. But giving is tremendously beneficial. And again, giving of all different, sorts, time, money, etc. And then 3, and this is really the big one, and we've already talked about it, relationships. Building good relationships is essential. And that's in your personal life, in your professional life. It doesn't have to be getting married. It doesn't have to be being a parent, but it has to be having quality relationships with people who care about and who care about you.
I just want to pick up on the one point about the connections and the relationships. And as well as we get older, those tend to be sometimes harder to make and harder to sustain for a variety of reasons. If you have kids and maybe they don't live in the same city as you do, and just as you had mentioned earlier on, maybe your spouse passed away. Do you have any thoughts on and strategies on how we can sort of up our game when it comes to relationships and connections?
I love that question because it's so practical, right? So I'll say 2 things. One, I am a big fan of joining things. So that could be in your community, find something, whether it's a book club, whether it's a volunteer activity. I started about 2 years ago volunteering for a foster dog organization in my town. So it's a bunch of people, mostly women, not all women, mostly women. And literally all we do is they bring up, I live in Massachusetts, they bring up dogs typically from like Tennessee and Texas, and you foster them, and then eventually they get adopted and they go out. So it's this wonderful group of people. We have a WhatsApp group that shares pictures of puppies like all the time, like every day, hundreds of puppies. We give other advice, hey, dog isn't sleeping through the night, or dog isn't crate trained, or whatever. And it's this wonderfully supportive group. So again, getting involved in something you care about. So that's 1. 2, I think we underestimate how valuable little things like texting is. We have to be physically with someone, reaching out and texting a friend. I'm thinking about you. Hope you're doing well. FaceTiming. That we don't have to be physically present with someone to show that we care and we're thinking about them. So you can actually reach out and form connections, even if, your children, live far away, or even if your, longtime high school friends are in a different country. That just checking in, making regular points of connecting, whether it's by phone or text, is really valuable.
Yeah, excellent point. And certainly with COVID, I think that really taught us that there were ways to make connection, continue the connection, even though we couldn't potentially be physically in the same space. So great point. I want to turn to a section that I call our readers want to know. So these are questions that are from our book club members. So one reader asks, is there a key strategy for people who aren't very happy naturally in order to boost their happiness?
Yeah, so I'm really glad the person asked that question, because it's one I get a lot. And here's what I'm going to say. There is not a key strategy, because it's not a one size fits all. People are different. And I give the examples that often I'll talk about this subject, or, give us talk about it, about science of happiness. And somebody will say to me, don't tell me to meditate. I hate meditating. I'm like, hey, don't meditate. Like I'm not paid by the meditation people. Like, don't meditate. That's fine. And I say that because for some people, it's like, you really like to read. Hence you have a book club and a book podcast. Other people are like, yeah, I don't really like reading. And so it's fine. Don't read. And so to me, it's figuring out, for some people, it's jogging. And they're like, I love that runner's high. For other people, it's I love reading. For other people, it's I love meditating. And so again, figure out for you what feels good. And for different people, the answer is going to be different. I gave you, the answer before, pretty consistently across the literature. Spending time in nature, giving, and relationships are pretty strong predictors. But there are people who are like, you know what? Nature doesn't really do anything for me. I don't like bugs. I don't like the sun. Whatever. And that's fine. So again, what I think is important is that you figure out what works for you, and you recognize that may not be the thing that works for your friend, your neighbor, your child, your sister, whatever. It's individual.
Yeah. Thank you. So this is from another one of our readers. Can a negative mindset rub off on a positive mindset? So if you're in a relationship with someone that maybe has a negative mindset, could that potentially impact your positive mindset, or maybe
I
vice
mean,
versa?
yeah, I mean, happiness is contagious and so is sadness. I mean, that is actually true. And so what I say to people is if you're in a relationship or it's your, colleague or friend or, spouse or whatever who's negative, um, take some steps to do some self-care. If it's somebody that you maybe don't live with, so sometimes people say, my sister is always so negative. I'll say, listen, after you're going to have lunch with your sister, make a plan immediately after to, I'm going to watch a funny video, or I'm going to call a friend who's different, or I'm going to go for a run, or, whatever it is. Because yeah, happiness is contagious, but so is negativity.
Excellent. So you kind of want to buffer some of that negativity, or replace it with something positive after you've had that negative interaction, or that,
Yeah.
spent time with that negative person.
100%. Yes.
If someone finds themselves in a negative loop, is there anything that they can do to quickly shift positively?
Yeah, there is, although it takes a little practice. So there's a technique in cognitive psychology or cognitive behavioral psychology called thought replacement. And they actually do something where you put like a rubber band on your wrist, and every time you find yourself to have a negative thought, you snap it, and then you have this, and then you're like, okay, think positive. So one thing is this thought replacement. Two, sometimes just distracting yourself. So if you're in this sort of doom and gloom loop, figure out something. And that could be, I'm going to watch something that's funny. It could be, I'm going to read a funny book. It could be, I'm going to, go play tennis or pickleball. It could be, I am going to go out and, volunteer or plant flowers or do something. Finding some kind of substitution, because what the research shows is if you get yourself into a doom loop, or what clinical psychologists call rumination, it actually is really, it's hard to snap out of. And so finding ways to replace that through thoughts and or behavior is a really important thing to figure out how you can interrupt that process for yourself.
Great. Thank you. And now this question's from me. What I'd like to know is, what are you reading these days? Are you reading any good books?
So my goal for 2025 is to read more fiction. And so what I'm pouring myself into, because I read a lot of sort of academic books that are for like my job. And so what I'm trying to do is every night before bed, I'm trying to read for 15 minutes, and I'm trying to read a fiction book. And I read Tom Lake, a book by Ann Patchett, which I really enjoyed. And I just finished reading, I think it's called Yes Again, which I also really liked. So that's what I'm doing right now. My goal for this year is fiction.
Fantastic. I love it. Final thought. I'm just conscious of our time. Can you give us your final thoughts on happiness and mindset and longevity and shifting positive?
Yes, love that question. And so this is what I'm going to say. I am someone who is not naturally happy. I have a family history of anxiety and depression. I've lost, close relatives to suicide. So I come by unhappiness naturally and genetically. And yet there are things that you can do if you find yourself in that sort of doom loop or depression, which frankly, I think these days, many people are sort of feeling overwhelmed by the news that is pretty stark, many days right now. A lot of, tragedy and difficult things, that there are specific steps that we can all take to live happier lives. And what we know very clearly from empirical scientific data is that being happier is good for your health and is good for your longevity. So it's worth spending some time and energy and effort finding that happiness that we all deserve.
Thank you so much for being with us and giving us your insights into the power of mindset and its relation to health, happiness, and longevity. The book is The Positive Shift, Mastering Mindset to Improve Happiness, Health, and Longevity by Dr. Catherine Sanderson. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for this invitation to talk. I knew I was going to love our conversation. So thanks again for reading and talking.
Thank you.